Good.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 exciting minutes, guaranteed. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learned today that UK journalists could be jailed for up to 14 years for reporting on matters of public interest, all as part of a revised Official Secrets Act. My word. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to Hugo Rifkind. Hugo is a celebrated columnist in the Times and elsewhere, and we'll be talking to him about his take on government, democracy, Boris Johnson, and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. Details are on the What's On guide. If you go to whatsonguide.scot, you'll be able to leave questions there. Now, as you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So, in many respects, this is your show. We're live and we're free. So, no license, no problem. You can tune in all the time to the TNT Show. Now, to our guest tonight, The Nation Talks to Hugo Rifkind. How are you, Hugo?
I'm not too bad, thanks.
How's the pandemic affected you?
Recently, not so much, except, of course, everything's shutting down because so many people have been pinged and are isolating. Which is a problem for my kids at school, definitely, because kids. I'm down in London, where kids are still in school. We got pretty sick in about October, November sort of time, but not that sick, and fully vaccinated now, so I should be all right. I've got my antibodies and my vaccine, so I should be, doing okay.
But there's talk of all these new variants.
Yes. Well, we can only hope. I do know quite a lot of double vaccinated people who've tested positive recently, but none too sick. You've got to have some faith in the vaccines. The deaths are way down. The cases are soaring, but there's a lot of things that we don't even bother tracking the cases for anymore. And as long as the deaths stay as low as they are now, and they are low, then I'm relatively hopeful that life can get pretty normal.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed.
Absolutely.
And the family's well now. You're all well.
Yes, we're all fine now. Yeah,
that's great news. That's super. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Hugo. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
Sure. So I was born in Edinburgh. I grew up in the lovely Duddingston village. I lived there until I was until I went to university, really. I was at school at George Watson's College for, I don't know how long, 9 years. And then I went to Loretto, which is a sort of boarding school outside Edinburgh, for about 5 years. And then I went off to Cambridge University for 3 years. And then I bummed around the world to no particular purpose for a couple of years. And then I settled in London. It's pretty much my life story.
And your first job was as editorial assistant for the show business website, peoplenews.com.
Yes. So my first job, I'd come out of university, done not very much. I was trying to write novels. I had a flatmate, and I'd done a bit of work experience at some papers. And I had a flatmate who was temping. It was the .com boom. This is the late 90s. And he was temping in this internet incubator. And I gave them a CV to give to the people next door who were setting up a gossip website. And I got in there, and they paid me double what I'd been earning as a data entry temp until then. And I was there for about a year and a half, and it was great. And then someone from the Times read me writing on that website and commissioned me for the feature section. And that was 20 years ago.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So you've been with the Times for 20 years?
I've been staff at the Times since 2004 or 5, but I first wrote for them in 2001.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was a columnist for the Herald as well for about 5 years, around about sort of 2000 to 2005 or thereabouts. Yeah. A bit later, maybe. Yeah.
Was that quite a leap from the Herald to the Times?
In some way, weirdly enough, it was a sort of a step. I've got to say this carefully. It was sort of a step backwards because I'd been. I wrote features for the Times. I didn't write an opinion column for the Times until a while later. So I went from writing a weekly opinion column in the Herald to writing sort of smaller, funny feature stuff in the Times. And it was about another 5 years before I got an opinion column back again. So I missed that after I stopped writing it for the Herald. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you find writing a column? I do one for the Sunday National, and sometimes, you have to make things topical, and I have to submit copy on a Thursday for publication on a Sunday. That's a challenge. but when do you have to submit your copy? Because you had your column was yesterday.
Yes, so I do 3 a week. I do one op-ed. I do a funny column on Saturdays and a TV review on Saturdays. And the TV review is easy because it's just writing about the TV. I don't have to decide what's on the TV. I just write about it. The kind of the funny one, it's a sort of parody diary that I've been doing for a long time now, and that is relatively stressful, but I know the ropes. But the op-ed I just find frightening every week. I've probably written at least one opinion column every week for 15 years, if not more. And because I write Monday for Tuesday, which means I don't normally know what I'm writing about much before 8:30 on a Monday, and I need to start writing it at about 9 o'clock on a Monday. So it's quite a tight process, but it always seems to work so far.
How long does it take you?
Longer and longer, actually. I always thought that I'd sort of end up being able to knock them out in an hour or two, but no. The older I get, and the more I don't know. I guess it probably like my opinion column in the Times will take me. I'll normally file about 4 o'clock, so whatever that is between 10 and 4, and it takes me most of that time. Yeah.
So you work through the night?
No. This is morning to afternoon.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Gracious. How many words are in your column? Just a matter of interest.
950.
950.
Yeah. About that.
Yeah. And talking about your column this week, I mean, I loved it. I loved the one before, and I like this one too.
Thank you.
You're talking about Boris Johnson's philosophy.
Yes.
Of doing whatever you can get away with, while implying the public don't care. Will it end badly? Why do you think it will end badly? What evidence do you have for that, or is it just a feeling?
It's just a feeling. It's I don't do evidence in my columns. Don't be ridiculous. No, look, basically it's this recurring theme we get from this government, which is that whenever they've done something wrong, and they do plenty wrong, they haven't done much. I mean, I'm talking about sort of transgressions rather than sort of bad decisions, if you see what I mean. They haven't done huge things wrong, but there've been a lot of bubbling little scandals: the contracts, the flat decoration, who paid for Boris Johnson's holiday, all this kind of stuff. Well, all this stuff, whatever has been going on with Dominic Cummings, all this kind of stuff. The line that you get from very many cabinet ministers is the public aren't interested in that. The public aren't interested in that. And the point of my column was I'm a bit sick of the public aren't interested in that, because what the public aren't interested in that really means is we're not interested in that because we don't have to be, because we can get away with not being. And what that comes from with this government is it's a government that, of course, got going as a populist government directly against all the kind of institutions that hold the British state together, by which I mean the rule of law and Parliament and the courts. They use the Brexit votes in a way to seek to trump every last one of those. So of course they're always going to say if the public aren't interested, it doesn't matter. But I think that's a really dangerous populist philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, you make the point in your column, and I think it's a very good one. The reality is that I guess ministers can point to the opinion polls and say, well, you may think that, Hugo, but look at the numbers. The numbers speak for themselves. We're far more popular than the main opposition party. So why should we care?
Yeah, and I mean, and they're right. They are. I mean, although the by-election we had down here, the Chesham and Amersham by-election last month or the month before, was quite interesting because that showed a sort of disintegration in the Tory vote outside London, sort of London overspill. But the trend is very much. I mean, if there was an election tomorrow, I don't think Boris Johnson would lose many seats, if any at all.
In fact, he might be able to add one or two.
Well, quite, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, you can see. It seems to me I can understand why they do it. But you make the point that there's an unconcealed disdain for Parliament, courts, expertise, conventions, expectations, watchdogs, regulators, and the rule of law, and basically anything else that stood in the way of the crassest possible interpretation of majority will. And you say it will get ugly.
Yes. Well, I mean, because I think they'll keep doing this with policy. They'll keep doing this with when they're trying to push things through Parliament. Even they'll when they I mean, it's impossible to say when you don't know what the policy will be. But if there's a policy that is taken to court, that they'll insinuate that the judges are politically biased for opposing it. This is just what they've done so far. It's not how a government ought to operate. A government ought to respect the structures under which it operates, I think.
Yeah, and that's a challenge in the UK, though, isn't it? Because in most countries there would be a constitution and it would constrain the government. The constitution here is more, I'm a good chap, you're a good chap. I won't do anything that upsets the apple cart too much, because when you obtain power, I wouldn't want you to do that stuff to me.
I'm not sure it practically makes that much difference, because you get politicians in the US where there's a very strong constitution still railing against judges from both sides of the spectrum, seeking to appoint the judges they want and not the judges that they don't want, and the constitution doesn't really afford a huge amount of protection there. And in this country, although we don't have a written constitution, there's still it is still possible for the courts to overrule Parliament, or at least not overrule Parliament, but at least force Parliament to overrule them, if you see what I mean. It's more murky and convoluted, but I think the practical upshot is much the same.
Yeah, I guess here, if the government finds that the courts not back a law, they can simply say, we're going to change the law then.
Yes.
It's simple.
Yeah, but it takes a while, and it's a hassle, and they need a majority, and it's embarrassing, and it's not by the same terms, theoretically, in the United States, the Senate can change the Constitution, but they just kind of don't.
But they would need a super majority to get that through.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what we say on this show is that the British Constitution is essentially whatever the government of the day with a working majority says it is.
I don't think that's totally fair, because you do have the enormous power of the Supreme Court as well to rule on things like this, and you do have I'm not a fan of the House of Lords, but you do have the House of Lords getting in the way and making all this more complicated. So it's not there aren't clear rules that constrain them, but there are murky ones. I may say I'm not in favor of this system. I'm simply saying this is what my view is. I think it's nuts myself, but yeah. Yeah,
it does. When you're sitting outside of it, it does look not so much murky, but it's so much of it depended on people observing conventions. Mm-hmm. There were no specific rules as such. It's just that the different parties decided that these conventions were helpful and useful.
Yeah,
it seems to me that the flaw always was in the constitutional arrangements in the UK was if there ever any party ever obtained power who decided to disregard those conventions, then we'd be in a god-awful mess.
Absolutely, which is pertinent today, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, all we've got is, it's not a party that's decided, hey, we're going to bend the rules. They make up the rules, so therefore they can say, if you think they're bent, we'll change them. We'll make them stay again. Yeah, sure. That troubles you. What's your feeling about Boris Johnson? We gather from the interview with Laura Kuenssberg that Dominic Cummings gave recently that he was only there on sufferance, i.e. that a network of people decided they didn't like him and they planned to get rid of him.
Dominic Cummings is an odd one, right? He says, they didn't manage to get rid of him, did they? Look who they got rid of in the end. I'm sure Dominic Cummings thinks that his sort of background hum of sort of vote leave was pulling all the strings in Downing Street, and indeed a lot of us thought that as well. But he's the one who's gone in the end. So I'm not sure that was quite right. I actually agree with quite a lot of Dominic Cummings' analysis of Boris Johnson about his abilities or lack thereof and all the rest of it. I just wish Dominic Cummings had agreed with him a year ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever. I think Cummings is Cummings is he's a disgrace, isn't he? He's absolutely he's put this man in power. He brags about having made Brexit come about, and I think he's probably right. And he completely absolves himself of any responsibility for all of it. So the fact that he's like a stop clock turns out to be right just once in a while by saying that the man he put in power is useless. It's like, well done. So some of us were writing columns saying that a decade ago. It's crazy. Yeah,
it is crazy because he doesn't appear to operate within the constraints of any sort of moral code.
No, I think that's right, or at least not one that anyone else can. I'm sure he thinks he does, but not one that anyone else can recognize. He's a bit of a mystery to me, Cummings, because I understand how he won the Brexit vote by pretending it was about various things it wasn't about. But I don't really understand what he thinks it really is about. I don't really understand. I don't understand. I understand how he won Brexit. I don't understand why he won Brexit. And I'm not sure he does either.
Well, I think his answer might be, look, I was hired to do a job. I did my job. What's wrong with that?
But he was always, I mean, he was always a supporter. You know, he wasn't just, you know, he did, he's always been a Brexiter. He does believe in Brexit. I just can't quite figure out why, because it doesn't seem to match with any of the rest of his philosophy, which is different, which is quite kind of, you know, sort of science-based and technocratic, and just not in any way what the kind of sort of madness of Brexit seems to be turning into.
Isn't that, to a degree, what the States has taught us here? When it comes to people who want to win elections, they go about it professionally. They're not terribly fussed about who's right or who's wrong, about ethical principles or moral codes. You know, I'm a hired gun. You hired me to do it. I'll do it. You know?
Yeah, I find that quite hard and sort of unacceptable. I think there's but maybe that's the luxury of my position as a journalist. I don't have to win. I just need to write about it. But I have the luxury to think that there's more important things than winning. But I do. Well,
it seems to me, if you're looking for a sustainable future, there has to be things other than winning. Morals and ethics matter. That's what makes a society in the end. I mean, if we're going to say these don't matter, gracious, where will that leave us?
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of the scorched earth approach of Johnsonism. It's more or less what I was writing about.
Yeah, and I think it was spot on. By the way, we've had a question from Edna Reed. She's saying, Hugo, how worried are you about this prospective new law, revised Official Secrets Act, that would constrain journalists from dealing with public interest matters? How much does that trouble you?
If that's what it does, then it troubles me greatly. I don't quite as yet understand the detail of it. It seems to me that what this is actually about, this law, and I mean, I might be getting this wrong because I've only got a superficial, you know, it's only broken today. I've only got a superficial understanding of it. What this is actually about is the difficulty of people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who call themselves journalists. I think are journalists myself. And yet operate in a way more like traditional espionage, and do pose a really genuine problem to the national security of countries who they target and countries who they leak from. Myself, I'm not in favor of criminalizing that, even for someone. I think Assange is a terrible, terrible person, but I'm not in favor of criminalizing the sort of things WikiLeaks does at all. I think it is journalism, just often quite bad and irresponsible journalism, but journalism nonetheless. If I thought this law would actually get in the way of investigative journalism of any sort, make it harder for whistleblowers or that kind of stuff, then absolutely I'd be quite shocked by it. I don't know that yet, but it may well.
Well, it does sound on the face of it. I mean, it's very difficult to argue when a government says, look, you know, that this is part of official secrets. We have to protect the country. The first responsibility of a government is to safeguard the citizens. And if some journalists are putting that safeguarding process at risk, because again, we have no written constitution that guarantees
freedom of speech and all the rest.
So therefore, the government is perfectly at liberty to abolish what might have been a convention of having press freedom or freedom of expression. Because I gather they've just abolished the rights to demonstrate, which seem to be fairly fundamental in democracy.
I mean, I would say with this government, they're not very good at stuff, right? And I think they'll and they're also, the Conservative Party even now is not an instinctively authoritarian party. It's quite a libertarian party. Everything's been a bit weird over the last year and a half, granted, but still. And so I think if it emerged that this really did affect the free speech of journalists, affect investigative reporting, I think that the government would struggle quite hard to get it through the House of Commons, because this is exactly the kind of thing that backbench Tories like to rebel about. But we shall see. It's early days.
Yeah. What's your take on Brexit? You are not a supporter, were you?
No.
Or are you?
No. No, I try very hard on a daily basis to be resigned to it and struggle. It's I mean, and it's a very simplistic way. I think it's just fundamentally a bad idea. On a more complex way, I feel very much European. My wife is German. My kids speak German. I spend in the normal world, I spend a decent amount of time in Germany. I feel very connected to the continent. I also think in a sort of British context, it was sort of Brexit's never been what it pretends to be. It's never really been about Britain sort of, being a more detached, self-sufficient nation. It was actually a kind of a sort of a political rebellion by a kind of a sort of a slight underclass of the political right who wanted to overthrow what they saw as being the establishment. It was the people in the people in the less attractive corridors of power fighting against the people in the more attractive corridors of power. And I think there's been so much deceit that's been required to maintain the fiction that Brexit is a good idea, that it just sort of discredits everybody. I mean, you had Dominic Cummings yesterday saying anyone who claims to be confident that they know Brexit is a good idea is completely mad. And it's like, what? You're saying this now? I think there was a lot of deceit. There was a lot of subterfuge. It's funny. So when the week before the Brexit referendum, the paper before a lot of elections, the paper will send a bunch of us on kind of sort of road trips around the country to go and take the temperature, find out as much as we can what people are thinking wherever they are. Before the Brexit referendum, I was up in Shetland because I hadn't been to Shetland before. I'd always wanted to, and the paper says, "Where in Britain do you want to go?" I'm like, "Shetland, please." And Shetland was largely, both in my experience, but also, as the poll showed, largely Remainer at the time. But there were a lot of fishermen who were very, very pro-Brexit, up in the islands and all the islands, but all round, but particularly in Shetland. And they've been very, very hard done by. They were just basically lied to. And there's not yet been the political comeback against this government for what will turn out to be I think a sort of a fairly long list of people who are just feeling cheated and robbed, who did not get what they were promised. They pulled a bit of a fast one with the car manufacturers so far, but I think all these chickens eventually come home to roost. Although the kind of chlorinated chickens this time.
But it does seem to be the case, though, that case that was made for Brexit wouldn't have succeeded unless a whole bunch of I'm using the term loosely here, Labour voters in the north of England in particular weren't convinced that it was a good idea. And some of the research suggested that what motivated at least some of them was anti-immigrant prejudice, i.e. what they bought into more than anything else, because they're not necessarily fishermen or farmers, was, hey, this is going to enable us to control the borders, which was a piece of sophistry that meant essentially we're against immigration, and if you vote for it, I mean, would you agree with that? Is that?
Oh, I mean, 100%. This is again what Vote Leave did. They looked at every issue where they thought they could help to turn the vote, and immigration was absolutely one of them. On immigration, it was more cynical than that. Vote Leave actually talked relatively little about immigration beyond the sort of spreading the kind of the myth that Turkey was about to join the EU. But they actually talked relatively little on immigration and left that instead to Nigel Farage's mob, left that instead to Leave EU, who were prepared to say much more incendiary, I was going to say borderline racist, I'm not sure we need the borderline things. And there was a sort of tacit, there seems to have been a sort of tacit idea among the more mainstream Vote Leave side of the Brexit campaign that we'll let them do that. Well, we won't need to get our hands dirty. They knew perfectly well what they were doing. Yeah.
And Farage has followed that through. I'm not sure you've seen the clip that's all over social media this afternoon.
No, I've not.
Well, it's pretty gruesome stuff, and you might want to take a stiff drink before you watch it. It depicts Nigel Farage on a boat pointing to a boat full of migrants / refugees alongside, saying that what they're doing is deplorable and they probably stole the boat that they're in. And I'm quoting him now, if the weather were to puff up it will be the end of that lot.
Is this recent? Is this from today? I mean, is this
just today? It's a promo for his show on GB News.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, when people tell you who they are, believe them. Nigel Farage has been. I mean, it's not a surprise to find out Nigel Farage thinks these things. He's always thought these things. He's always proudly thought these things. It's not so long ago he was talking about how uncomfortable he feels on a train when people are speaking another language. My wife and kids speak another language on a train.
Yeah, exactly.
It's he's yeah.
What do people in Germany think when you're sitting and chatting about Brexit?
Oh, they think we're crazy. I mean, they think it's very sad. They think we're crazy. They're bewildered by our perception of the European Union. I will say I'm not a huge fan of the European Union. I just think being in it is a good deal better than not being in it. But people as is the case in many countries, people in Germany are much better informed about our politics than we are about theirs, and they think that we were conned, we as the electorate, rather than personally. They think that Brexit was the cynical project it was. Then I think, but mainly they're just sad.
Yeah. Don't you think there are particular ramifications here when it comes to Scotland?
Because, yes.
I mean, Scotland voted categorically no.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, Scotland. I mean, look, there's two ways of looking at it. As a nation, Scotland voted categorically no. As a part of the UK, Scotland represents a fairly small part of the Remain vote. About an eighth, I think. And I mean, Scotland voted categorically no, but Scotland's still roughly a third of Scots voted yes. So while there's two issues here. There's the impact of Brexit on Scotland, which I believe to be considerable, but I'm wary of the kind of, not to suggest you're doing this, but the myth that somehow trotted out that the issues of Brexit, the debate of Brexit, the division of Brexit is something from which Scotland is somehow immune, because I don't think that's quite right. It's just the balances are a bit different. In terms of, I mean, the Brexit is the worst of all possible worlds for Scotland, because Brexit makes the situation of being in the United Kingdom considerably less attractive, while also making the situation of leaving the United Kingdom considerably less attractive. So, there's which I guess is why there's so much anger in Scotland about it. I mean, my kind of Scottish hinterland. Most Scots I know are unionists. I would say, which probably says quite a lot about my background as much as it does anything else. And most of them I will say have since swung back. But in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, a good number of them were not unionists for at least a year, I would say.
What about you? You signed a letter back in 2014 with, I think, 200 others saying you were opposed to independence. Do you still feel that way?
Oh yes, I mean, I do. I'm a Scot who lives in London. I like my nation, what I consider to be my nation, to make sense. But I mean, I don't know, the sort of unionist I am. I don't know. You can never know. I don't think I'm an ideological unionist. If a majority of Scots want independence, then there should be independence. I'm not like I don't think it's. I wouldn't be anti-democratic about it. My preference is for the United Kingdom to continue for a bunch of reasons that are as much to do with what I think is good for me as what I think is good for Scotland.
Yeah. So, but the government has said, look, we're not democratic. If you want a referendum, you can't have it. Michael Gove said that.
Yeah. I don't agree with that. I can understand why they're saying that, because I mean, it is a problem for a Westminster government to agree to a perpetual string of referendums, because yes only needs to win once, and no needs to win every time. So I can understand politically it makes sense. Also, as previously discussed, they think they can get away with it. But I mean, I'm of the view, and again, I don't have to make these decisions, so it's easy for me to be of this view. But I'm of the view that unions need democratic legitimacy. I think Spain got in all manner of trouble by not finding a mechanism by which they could permit a referendum, which did infinitely more harm than would have happened if they had permitted one. Particularly, it doesn't seem likely that there would have been Catalan independence had they had a kind of a free and fair referendum. So I mean, I don't think you win the argument against Scottish independence by denying Scots autonomy and democracy. It just doesn't make sense to me.
In fact, the government has gone in the opposite direction. They are now implementing what they refer to as muscular unionism, which is to overrule legislative consent motions, etc. I take it you're not in favour of muscular unionism. That's what you do.
I don't quite know what it is. I mean, I might be if it was actually, if it meant what it said on the tin. They don't look, if the constituency, when they talk about muscular unionism, was actually we want to embrace Scots more fully into the bosom of Westminster politics, then I mean that's not my preference. I think I'm much more of a federalist, but I'd still sort of respect the ambition of it. But actually, when they talk about this, that's a signal they're sending to their own. That's the signal they're sending to the kind of sort of slight English nationalist movement.
Yes,
it's not really about Scotland at all. It's about resentment of what is perceived as being the special status, the enviable and special status of devolution. It's about resentment of that is felt by some conservatives in the South and by some red wall voters and so on.
I mean, isn't that sort of, on one sense, a reasonable conclusion to come to, which is that Scotland does appear to have a special status, mainly because devolution was handled in such a sort of strange way. I mean, it wasn't devolution across the whole island, it was devolution to bits of it.
Yeah.
And that must be very confusing for people who are not in the bits to understand why it was done this way.
Yes, although in many respects that's their fault for voting against it wherever they are. You know, there could have been a Yorkshire Regional Assembly. You know, I think John Prescott wanted one, didn't he? You know, look, it's very interesting talking about it from the perspective of London. London has considerable devolution in many respects. In some practical respects, devolution almost to rival Scotland's. You know, in terms of a lot of sort of transport and infrastructure and local spending and all that kind of stuff. There's just vast swathes of England where there's almost none. And I mean, I think the idea, once upon a time, when Tony Blair dreamed of devolution in Scotland, he wanted devolution in Cornwall and in Yorkshire and in the Midlands, and that, from his perspective, would have kind of sort of neutralised the independence threat. But the English just weren't keen and remain unkeen. You know, they keep voting against directly elected mayors as well, and on much the same basis.
Which takes us neatly on to the point you made about a federal system, because many of the unionists I interview on this program favour a federal system, what they sometimes call home rule. I'm not quite sure quite what those terms mean, and when we explore them, we invariably end up in a bit of a dead end, because again, this would require people who have no real interest in constitutional reform having to accept it. I mean, why should they? Why should there be some sort of enormous change to the UK's constitutional arrangements just because some groups are upset? I mean, why should others who are not upset have to put up with all this constitutional tinkering?
Well, the thinking behind it is that the English, or English politicians at least, could be convinced that it works to their advantage, because English politicians would no longer have to deal with a sort of an unwieldy Scottish body in the House of Commons, I guess. But I mean, you can't. I mean, either England resents the status of Scotland, in which case it'll want to resolve the situation, or it doesn't, in which case there isn't a problem. So I mean, I don't think that's so terrible. Look, federalism is not a perfect solution if you're a unionist, and even as a soft unionist. What I don't like about federalism is that it makes it pretty unlikely, at least in most sort of structures that seem likely, makes it pretty unlikely that there would ever again be a Scottish Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, because it would be simply, I mean, unless we're in some kind of sort of minority coalition type situation, that's a pretty difficult thing for a unionist to swallow. But I'm not sure there are easy solutions to that.
There's certainly, I mean, when we've talked about this in the past, people who favour a federal system, I mean, you would have to start off with a written constitution. You couldn't get by with what we've got just now. You'd have to actually frame it in such a way that the arrangements would be beyond political tinkering by jobbing politicians. They would have to be only amendable through some sort of supermajority or 2/3 majority vote. But even that probably wouldn't be. First of all, you'd have to develop a constitution, and that means you'd have to get sort of popular approval of it. It's hard to see how that could happen in any sort of timescale less than 5 to 10 years. You would then have to somehow convince people that as part of this written constitution, it naturally flows that there be a federal system. And then you would have to agree what the limits on that federal system might be acceptable to the majority. And I could see that being a major problem. I mean, Quebec, for example, they already had a federal system, and then they chose to want to change it again. And that did not succeed, but nonetheless, it was a federal system, and clearly it doesn't put an end to separatist feelings necessarily. It may appease, but it wouldn't necessarily remove those feelings. And it's just hard to see how you could develop a constitution without having to address the position of the House of Lords, for example.
Oh, well, you mean you address the position of the House of Lords the simplest way you address the position of the House of Lords is that you transform the House of Lords into a fully elected upper chamber, and that becomes a fully elected upper chamber for the entire United Kingdom. And then you downgrade the House of Commons to being England's Parliament. I mean, is one way that you do that, but you certainly couldn't. You certainly couldn't overhaul the Constitution to the extent of having a federal Britain while leaving things like the House of Lords intact. But I'm not really of the view that you should be leaving the House of Lords intact anyway. So that's fine by me.
Yeah, I mean, it is the second largest unelected legislature in the world, if I remember it, after China. And it makes it difficult to argue for democracy elsewhere when you have that.
It made it difficult to argue for the United Kingdom during the Scottish independence referendum, because you have to look at these bits and go, which bits can I defend? And it's like, well, not that. I mean, it's a bit like we were talking about the unwritten constitution we have earlier. In practical terms, the House of Lords works fairly well. You know, it doesn't have enough teeth to cause real problems with democracy, and it does have a decent watchdog function, and it is a good kind of repository for elder statesmen who still have a useful contribution to make, who can't be parked anywhere else, and nor do we necessarily want them to be. All that being said, it's indefensible. So but that's kind of the British way. We quite often do both those things at once.
Yeah, and I think when we looked at it, there are only 2 legislatures in the world which expressly permit clerics to vote if you leave the Vatican aside.
Let me guess. Imagine Iran's one of them.
That's it. Iran and the UK are the only 2 in the world. But specifically,
makes sense.
Again, not necessarily a great example out there, but it does. Anyone looking at this must think it looks very odd to have all these unelected people at £300 a day attendance allowance making laws, and they can't. And they don't ever offer themselves up for public approval.
But I mean, so I'm not saying it's necessarily, of course, it's not necessarily the same thing. It's not even slightly the same thing. But all political systems have their anti-democratic quirks. The party list system, for example, is, once you sweep in on that, it's quite hard to say how that is remotely justifiable, because that's a sort of pretend democracy where you can't actually really get rid of people.
Yes.
It's not quite the House of Lords, but I mean, there are no political systems that are pure as pure, I think.
Yeah. I think that was the way Churchill put it, wasn't it? It's democracy is a lousy system until you look at the other.
Just all the other.
I was struck by a piece that David Aronovich wrote back in June 30 of this year, in which he headlined it, or the editor headlined it, "England is stuck and the union will pay for it." Do you recall that piece?
I did, I do, yes.
How much of that would you agree with, do you think?
I can't remember exactly what he said, but I agree that there's a problem. there's a problem in England with English identity, and it's a problem that is of relevance to Scotland too, because I think Scotland quite often misunderstands English identity quite badly. So a frustration for me during the independence referendum was that the picture of England that was painted in a lot of the pro-independence arguments just didn't make any sense to me. I lived in multicultural London. It was like you'd have to travel a long way to find the nearest Conservative MP. It's instinctively liberal at all levels of wealth. You know, in this part of North London, it's incredibly multicultural. It's Remain, and not the Remain and Brexit were a thing yet. It's in many respects a lot of what sort of Scottish civic nationalism aspires towards, and yet it was constantly painted as the sort of the London demon, which I found very, very difficult. You know, there are reasons why I moved here, you know, and it wasn't for that. But at the same time, there's a very different England out there. You know, there's a very different England. We saw it at the football. You know, you see it, and you see it in England, a lot of England's small towns, and it's and that doesn't have a lot of parallel in Scotland in quite the same way, but it also doesn't have a very functional relationship with the English cities. You know, and it's not just a London thing; it's also a Manchester thing, and to a lesser extent, but also a Birmingham thing, and a York thing. It's an everywhere thing, really. Just London is the metropolis, so it dominates it all. But so England has a real confusion between its cities and its small towns, basically, which means that it doesn't really, as a nation, know where it is, and the things that it might gather around, in the same way that Scotland manages to gather around symbols of identity, have often been so contaminated that some people just won't go near them.
Contaminated by whom?
Well, they've been contaminated in both directions. Sometimes they've been contaminated by embraced by the right. Sometimes they've been contaminated by sort of, you know, squeamishness by the left. Think of like Emily Thornberry and her complaint about a house decked out in the flag of St. George, which offended an awful lot of people, not all of whom she meant to offend. You know, so I mean, the English left is incredibly squeamish about national identity in a way that isn't a problem for the Scottish left at all. Yeah, and
why do you think that is? Why do you think the left has a problem?
Well, it's partly because Englishness has been slow. Well, no, take it the other way around. It's to do with the advantages in a multicultural society of the concept of Britishness, right? It's very hard. It's not very hard. It's relatively hard for an immigrant from elsewhere in the world to come to England and say they are English. It's very easy to say you're British, you're a British Indian, you're a British Nigerian. That's very easy. Works in the same kind of way as American. Yeah. There is a slight culture of disambiguation between that and English. To some people, English means ethnically English. That's never been a problem in Scotland. You know, my great-grandparents came to Scotland from Lithuania. As far as they were concerned, they were Scottish Jews. You know, they might have considered themselves to be British Scottish Jews, but I don't think that would have occurred to them, really. So Scotland's just never really done that. Whereas the umbrella of Britishness has in England generally often been used to sort of disambiguate between ethnic minorities and, for want of a better phrase, the ethnic English. And it's quite hard for people to get away from that.
Don't you think it has to be tackled at some stage, though? Because
yes.
I think David's point is it's polluting the debate.
Yeah, but I think, so where I differ slightly with David is I think a lot of these problems we only actually notice once they're getting better. You know, you look at the English football team. You know, they're English rather than British. You know, that's the whole point, and they probably instinctively know the difference, I'd have thought, and they are that kind of elusive English identity that people have been sort of struggling to get their teeth into. I do think England still has a problem, though, of a kind of how to put it, a folk identity, you know, in a way that, again, is very easy for Scotland. It's slightly artificial in Scotland. It's also, you know, manufactured by Sir Walter Scott. Nonetheless, it's there. And England hasn't really had that kind of, sort of pastoral identification resurgence in the same kind of way. There's some very interesting. There's been some very interesting attempts to find it. Like Jez Butterworth is who wrote Jerusalem and other stuff is a sort of great exploration in that direction. Danny Boyle's Olympic ceremony was kind of nodding at times towards a sort of pastoral Englishness that is right on the edge of English comprehension, but it's not formalized in the same way as the kind of Scottish sort of geographical patriotism, the love of the mountains, the thrill of seeing a loch, the real identification with the land. England hasn't really got that.
But do you think it's going to have to find it somehow?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. But it's difficult. It's hard to do. It's hard to find. I mean, some of the things that I was saying then, you say them in a different context, and they come dangerously close to sort of to blood and soil nationalism. And you've got to, you kind of. I mean, there's a very small difference between a kind of sort of a left-wing English socialist singing Jerusalem and Nigel Farage singing Land of Hope and Glory, and you kind of not everyone necessarily gets the difference between those two things, but they are of course very different. Well,
you talked about the England football team, and I mean, outstanding, absolutely outstanding. But these three guys who took the penalties got all sorts of abuse from people who described themselves as England supporters.
Well, yes, they did, and that's shocking. As to whether they got a lot of abuse, it depends what you mean. I mean, Twitter was talking about about 1,000 to 2,000 tweets. It's a lot of people in England, I mean, you look at the Rashford mural that was defaced in Manchester. A lot more people went and sort of stuck message of support on that than defaced it. So I mean, while these things are shameful, are embarrassing for England, that the three black players should have been targeted in that way. I mean, I think there's a danger in assuming that kind of thing is, say, worse than it was 20 years ago. And I think actually it's a lot better than it was 20 years ago, just more visible.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do I know? I mean, I'm not a black footballer, and I'm sure if I was, I might have a different view on that. But from my perspective, that's how it looks.
Well, sadly, I gather the Spectator took a pop at Marcus Rashford today.
I've not seen that actually. I saw that. I thought that he was saying they were going to, but I've not seen what.
They did. Which is slightly worrying again. David's point is that, as he put it, unless we start planning a radical new constitutional settlement, the United Kingdom looks certain to splinter. Mm-hmm. It's what I find interesting is that here we have commentators saying, "Look, we need to take a look at this, guys," but I see no appetite out there in the political environment for this, either from the Conservatives nor Labour. And the Lib Dems appear to have given up on Brexit altogether.
Yeah.
But there's no, I mean, there would have to be, you can't have a constitutional change of any kind, really, because you're talking big deal here.
Yeah.
Without the support of both the main parties. You would have to have that. You couldn't possibly scramble about doing this on the edges. Certainly not the terms that David describes about a radical new constitutional settlement that would require the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, to be roughly on board. And I see no evidence of that whatsoever.
Yes, you've got to find a way to make it make sense for England for the two main parties to be on board. I mean, I think so. I mean, David's view is very common among people on the English left now, that the situation currently is intolerable. And the reason why it's so common is because they identify very strongly with the objections to the United Kingdom of Scottish nationalists. And they say, clearly these people have a case and we don't want to lose them. There are two reasons why, however, it might not get anywhere. And only one of them is the fact that England won't unite around it. The other is that, to put this tactfully, there might not be that Scottish majority for independence that is quite strong enough to alarm the Westminster government into movement at all. If it's if you're involved on either side of the Scottish independence debate, then things rumbling around a yes vote that rumbles around between 45 and 48% always feels on the cusp of being a very big deal. But if it always rumbles around between 45 and 48%, you can probably calculate as a Westminster politician that you can just ignore that for another generation. That may be what happens.
Well, to put it in context, I think the yes, according to opinion polls, when David Cameron agreed to the last Section 30, I think the yes vote was running about 30%. So it moved dramatically over the course of the campaign.
Yeah.
And I guess if I was sitting in Whitehall as part of the unionist unit there, I'd be slightly troubled. I would want that 45, 49% to drop below 40 before I would think about offering something.
I think so. Yeah,
because otherwise you're definitely running the risk, particularly if it.
Well, that was Cameron's mistake with Brexit. I mean, that was exactly Cameron's mistake with Brexit.
Exactly.
But I think it's possible that the hand just isn't quite forced in that way, which is unsatisfactory on a democratically speaking. But maybe what happens.
Yeah, I mean, the likelihood too is that the reaction to so-called muscular unionism might be that it might drive more people into that situation of saying, well, what does one do if one consistently rejects the party in power and votes for someone else? I wanted to ask you a question, which it's intrigued me for some time, and I've never quite got a satisfactory answer. So if you don't mind, Hugo, I'm going to ask you the question. And it's this. If you look at secessionist or independence movements across the world, that there's invariably a right-wing component to that. There may be left-wing groups, but there's generally a right-wing component, and it's usually based on blood and soil and all that crap. That for some reason that doesn't happen in Scotland. There's a very broad church represented by the SNP, and the question is why. I mean, why aren't there a whole range of different independence parties as you would get elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean it's a very good question, and I honestly don't know. I mean, it must exist in Scotland. No society is free from prejudice and racism and chauvinism. So obviously there will be a body of Scottish nationalism that is exactly that. Scotland for the Scots. As to why it's not formalized, maybe just because nobody would vote for it, or it may be just be something to do with the sort of the cultural status of Britishness in Scotland, I don't want to say anything dangerous, but perhaps the mindset that would be attracted to that kind of politics more often than not finds other things to latch onto instead. Shaped by Scotland's history of sectarianism and the way different communities have formed is also possible. I honestly don't know. I will say though, when my my dad always talks about when his grandparents came to Edinburgh from Lithuania, the near absence of anti-Semitism that was faced in Scotland, which largely came from the Presbyterian tradition, which just hadn't done that, so there could be some lingering aspect of that. But honestly, that's one for a sociologist. I really don't know.
Well, thank you for that response, because it's the most helpful one that we've had today. I have to tell you that we've had some crackers. I have to tell you. Talking about your father, as you were briefly there, were you ever attracted to a political career?
Not really. I'm not an easy fit for any party, for one thing. So no. And I also I don't have the right sort of brain, I think. I think to be a politician, you've got to be very decisive, and you've got to be able to convince yourself of the right course of action and take decisions and live with the consequences. And that kind of thing gives me the terrors. So, so not really, no. I mean, there've been points where I've been more or less politically active, but not with a huge amount of confidence. I would say I'm not a confident political thinker at all.
So let me test you on this one then. If there were to be another referendum, would you campaign for no? If that was the question, was yes to separate, no, not to separate?
It depends slightly on the terms of the debate. It depends on my professional situation. I'm always deeply gratified in Scotland. Something I only really realised, because I've spent so little of my career in Scotland, beyond writing for the Herald, my career has been entirely London-based. I was sort of delighted and gratified by the reception I got for covering Scotland during the independence referendum, that I could go into communities and meet people, and they might know me from the Herald, they might recognize my surname because of my dad, but I was still treated with an enormous welcome and respect as someone different from all the other London interlopers who'd come to try and find out what was going on, which I was always kind of immensely grateful for. So I would think that, I mean, I reported quite extensively on the referendum last time, but I also realized the more I reported, the more it was pretty difficult to combine that with any sort of activism at all. So I think very possibly if there were another referendum, I'd try and park my views and just be a journalist. But I'm not sure, but I might not manage. But that would certainly be my ambition.
Well, it would be an interesting debate, wouldn't it? I mean, it was, we've only got a couple of 3 minutes left. Are there any points that you would like to make that we haven't covered, Hugh? Is there anything that you feel slightly strongly about that our audience might find helpful to know? Is there anything that bugs you? Is there anything that makes you feel, hey, we haven't covered X tonight, I'd like to do that?
No, I mean, not really. The only thing I'd put in those terms, I mean, this might sound a bit like sort of campaign advice, that it's not meant to be, but I find that in as much as I can follow the rhetoric and the campaigning of Scottish nationalists talk remarkably little about Scots who aren't Scottish nationalists. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of outreach going on among Scottish nationalists. Now, I'm sure the same is true for Scottish Unionists as well. But I'm always struck by, I'm sorry, this is a terrible thing to raise with a minute and a half to go, but I'm always struck by a movement that is, I mean, I respect the civic nationalism idea. I do think it is, as independence movements go, it is certainly an inclusive one. It doesn't seem to work very hard in trying to include Scots that don't necessarily agree with it, perhaps yet. And that, I think, is a long-term problem. But again, I'm sorry to drop that with so little time.
No, it's a perfectly reasonable point, and I'm glad you made it. One of the reasons that the TNT show has a whole range of guests
is doing exactly that. Sure,
we're doing exactly that because let's assume that independence were to happen. It behoves no one any good to have created sufficient divisions or maintained divisions or whatever you want to call it amongst a group of people who have ultimately to work together. And that makes no sense. It certainly doesn't make any sense to me, but I hope it doesn't make sense to anyone else either. But also it's good and healthy. If you believe in democracy, it seems to me you have to believe in the notion that there's folks out there who have a different view, perfectly reasonable points of view. And it's important that there's an opportunity that people get out of the silos. Because you watch what happens in the States and elsewhere and you think, well, that's just awful. Reasonable people should be able to talk to each other in a reasonable way without all this sort of nonsense about so-and-so represents this and so-and-so represents that. It seems to me that's a perfectly healthy thing. I mean, we've talked tonight a lot about democracy. It seems to me it's the cornerstone, if you're going to have a moral society, it seems to me that you have to respect everyone's point of view to the greatest degree you can. There's people like, for example, we touched upon Farage, when I would have great difficulty, frankly.
I don't have a huge respect for his point of view, I will say. Yeah.
But I wouldn't want that voice excluded because it seems to me if you truly believe in freedom of expression, you have to allow for all of it somewhere on the line. Anyway, that's my personal opinion. This has been very helpful. Thank you very much, Hugo.
Pleasure.
I have to say that I've enjoyed your remarks immensely. the audience have suggested that I should have asked you more questions about the arrangements in Scotland. I just felt that we were covering the bases anyway, and I hope everyone understands that. A big thank you to you, and a big thank you to everyone out there watching tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. We've, as I said, tried to take as many of your questions as we possibly can, and I would ask you if you found the show interesting and exciting or whatever, you tune into next week. Because we'll be talking to Fiona Campbell, who is an independence activist, next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Oh, please, and this is my personal plug, look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. I'll be dealing with the death of democracy in the UK and what might be done to ensure that Scotland does not go down the same path. You'll find the Constitution column in the 7-day supplement. If you like it, tell the editor. And very importantly, please support Indie Live and Indie Live Radio. Remember, no license, no problem. New voices for a new Scotland, and all the news perhaps you're not getting from elsewhere. And do support Indie Live wherever you can. Thank you and again, and a good night. A big thank you to Hugo. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. And COVID is having a great day too, with the leaders of the two main UK parties now in isolation. We wish them well. And to all of you watching and listening, stay safe and take care. Good night.